June 24, 1948, Soviet Headquarters, East Berlin. Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky reviewed reports from checkpoints surrounding West Berlin with quiet satisfaction. Every road into the city had been sealed, every rail line blocked, every barge denied passage. West Berlin, home to 2 million civilians and thousands of Allied troops, was an island deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, cut off, isolated, starving. The Americans will leave within weeks, Sokolovsky told his staff. Perhaps days. No city can survive without food, without coal, without supplies. The laws of logistics are absolute. His calculations were irrefutable. West Berlin consumed 4,500 tons of supplies daily just to survive. Food, medicine, coal for heating and power. The Soviets had strangled every ground route. The only path into the city was through the air, and no one had ever supplied an entire city by aircraft. It was mathematically impossible. What Sokolovsky didn't know was that 90 miles away, at Rhein-Main Air Base outside Frankfurt, American and British pilots were already climbing into C-47 Skytrains and loading the first bags of flour. Within 48 hours, they would begin an operation so audacious that Soviet military planners had never conceived it possible. They would supply an entire city through the sky. The Berlin Airlift was about to prove that determination could overcome tyranny, that logistics could defeat politics, and that ordinary men flying cargo planes could win a battle without firing a single shot. Picture it. West Berlin in June 1948. The city still bore the scars of war, rubble-lined streets, buildings reduced to shells, but 2 million people called it home, and they lived under Allied protection in the heart of Soviet-controlled East Germany. Stalin saw an opportunity. The Western Allies, America, Britain and France, depended entirely on ground transportation to supply their sectors of Berlin. Roads, railways and canals all ran through Soviet territory. One order could seal the city completely. On June 24, that order came. Soviet troops erected barriers across every highway. Railway switches were thrown, diverting all westbound trains. Canal locks closed. The Soviets claimed technical difficulties required the closures for maintenance. Everyone knew it was a lie. This was a siege. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor in Germany, faced an impossible choice. Abandon 2 million civilians to Soviet control, or find a way to supply an entire city without ground access. Every military manual ever written said cities couldn't be sustained by air. The numbers were devastating. West Berlin needed 4,500 tons of supplies per day minimum. That included food, coal, medicine, and raw materials to keep basic industry functioning. The largest airlift in history, the American supply operation in China during World War II, had managed 650 tons daily at its peak. Berlin needed 7 times that amount. Soviet planners laughed at the impossibility. One Russian officer was overheard saying, "Let them try to supply 2 million people with their toy airplanes, they'll be begging to negotiate within a month." But the Soviets had miscalculated. They had forgotten what American logistics could accomplish when pushed to the limit. The decision came from the top. President Truman refused to abandon Berlin. "We stay in Berlin, period," he told his advisors. But how? The only option was air supply. Using the 3 air corridors the Soviets had grudgingly allowed into Berlin, 20 miles wide each, stretching from the western zones into the besieged city. Through those narrow pathways, the Allies would have to deliver everything a city needed to survive. The logistics seemed insane. A city of 2 million required 4,500 tons daily. Each C-47 Skytrain, the workhorse transport aircraft available, could carry only 3 tons. That meant 1,500 flights every single day just to meet minimum requirements. And that was before accounting for weather, mechanical failures, or Soviet interference. General Clay didn't hesitate. "We'll do it," he said. "If we can deliver 500 tons the first day, we'll figure out how to deliver more tomorrow." On June 26, 1948, just 48 hours after the blockade began, the first C-47s touched down at Tempelhof Airport in West Berlin, carrying flour, milk and medicine. 32 flights, 80 tons of supplies. It was a drop in the ocean. Berliners had food for perhaps 3 more days. Soviet observers watched with amusement, certain the Americans would quit when they realized the futility. They were wrong. Within a week, American and British pilots were flying round-the-clock missions. Planes landed every 8 minutes at Tempelhof during daylight hours. Crews unloaded, turned around, and launched again within 30 minutes. The operation ran with assembly line efficiency, but it wasn't enough, not even close. The Americans named it Operation Victuals, a sardonic nod to the food they were delivering. The British called their effort Operation Planefare. Together they would attempt the impossible. General William Tunner took command of the airlift in July. Tunner was a logistics genius who had run the hump operation over the Himalayas during World War II. He looked at the Berlin problem like an engineer designing a machine. "This isn't flying," he told his pilots. "This is mass production with wings." Tunner revolutionized air transport. He established a conveyor belt in the sky. Planes departed Frankfurt or Hamburg every 3 minutes. They flew at different altitudes in precise stacks, separated by 500 feet vertically. When they reached Berlin, they descended in sequence, landed, unloaded, and immediately departed. No circling, no delays. If a pilot missed his approach, he returned to base with his cargo and tried again. The system demanded inhuman precision. Pilots flew the same route dozens of times daily, often in weather that would ground civilian aviation. They navigated through clouds, rain, and fog using primitive instruments. One mistake could cause a collision that would shut down the entire operation. Meet Lieutenant Gail Halverson, 27 years old, from Utah. Before the blockade, he was just another transport pilot. But one day in July, standing near the Tempelhof fence, he met a group of German children watching the planes land. These kids had nothing. The war had taken their fathers, destroyed their homes, left them living in rubble. Yet they stood quietly, watching the American planes with wonder. They didn't beg, they didn't complain, they just watched. Halverson reached into his pocket and found 2 sticks of chewing gum. He broke them into pieces and handed them through the fence. The children went wild with gratitude, passing the tiny pieces around, even smelling the wrappers. "I'll drop more tomorrow," Halverson promised. "Watch for my plane, I'll wiggle my wings." The next day, he tied candy bars to handkerchief parachutes and dropped them as he approached Tempelhof. Children flooded the area, scrambling for the tiny parachutes. Word spread, more kids came. Halverson soon nicknamed the Candy Bomber, recruited other pilots. They dropped thousands of candy parachutes over Berlin. Soviet propaganda had portrayed Americans as imperialist aggressors. Now German children watched American pilots risk their lives daily and drop candy from the sky. The psychological impact was devastating to Soviet narratives. But candy wouldn't keep Berlin alive. The airlift needed to deliver tonnage. By September 1948, the airlift was moving 4,500 tons daily, exactly the minimum Berlin needed. But winter was coming. Berlin would need coal for heating. Tons and tons of coal, or people would freeze to death. The Soviets knew this. They waited, confident that winter would break the airlift. Coal was heavy, bulky, and dirty. Transporting it by air was wildly inefficient. The math didn't work, but Tunner had already planned for it. He requisitioned larger aircraft, C-54 Skymasters, that could carry 10 tons each. More planes arrived from America. British Halifax bombers were converted to cargo haulers. French pilots joined the effort. The system accelerated. Planes landed in Berlin every 90 seconds during peak operations. Pilots flew 3 or 4 missions daily, grabbing sleep between flights. Ground crews worked in shifts around the clock, unloading aircraft with practiced speed. Germans themselves, many of them former enemies, joined the labor force, unloading American planes to save their own city. One pilot, Lieutenant Robert Riordan, described the routine. You'd land, taxi to the ramp, and German workers would swarm the plane. 10 minutes later, you were empty and rolling again. You'd grab a cup of coffee, file your next flight plan, and be airborne in 30 minutes, then do it all over again. The pace was brutal. Pilots flew in conditions that violated every safety regulation. Fog, ice, mechanical problems, none of it stopped the flights. If a plane went down, the wreckage was cleared, and the next aircraft landed moments later. Accidents happened. Between June 1948 and May 1949, 78 Allied personnel died in crashes related to the airlift. American, British, and German lives lost to keep Berlin free. Each death weighed on the crews, but they kept flying. There was no alternative. Think about that sacrifice. These weren't combat pilots hunting enemy fighters. They were cargo pilots hauling coal and flour into a city surrounded by potential enemies. But they understood something profound. They were fighting tyranny with logistics, proving that democracy could outlast dictatorship through sheer determination. Inside Soviet headquarters, confusion grew. The blockade should have worked. Every calculation said it was impossible to supply a city by air. Yet month after month, the planes kept coming. By December 1948, the airlift was delivering 4,500 tons daily despite winter storms. Soviet intelligence reports couldn't explain it. How were the Americans achieving this? One captured Soviet intelligence document from January 1949 revealed their bewilderment. The enemy operates a supply system beyond standard military doctrine. Aircraft land continuously without pause. They have abandoned all efficiency protocols in favor of sheer volume. This is not military logistics. This is industrial production applied to aviation. The Soviets had made a fatal assumption. They believed American logistics would follow European models, careful rationing, conservative planning, rigid adherence to doctrine. Instead, Americans threw resources at the problem with overwhelming abundance. When the C-47s proved insufficient, Americans flew in C-54s. When weather threatened operations, they flew anyway. When coal supplies ran low, they converted more cargo space. The American approach was wasteful by Soviet standards, but it worked. Soviet planners discovered what German generals had learned during World War II. American industrial capacity didn't follow normal rules. Where Soviets calculated minimum requirements, Americans exceeded them. Where Soviets conserved resources, Americans overwhelmed problems with surplus. Marshal Sokolovsky reported to Stalin in March 1949, "The blockade has failed to achieve its objective. The enemy sustains West Berlin at a higher standard than some areas of our own territory. Their determination exceeds our calculations." Stalin faced a choice: lift the blockade and admit defeat, or escalate to military confrontation. The latter risked war with America, a war the Soviet Union couldn't win in 1949. On May 12, 1949, the Soviets quietly lifted the blockade. The airlift had won. The Berlin Airlift lasted 318 days. From June 1948 to May 1949, Allied aircraft flew 278,228 flights into Berlin. They delivered 2.3 million tons of supplies, food, coal, medicine, raw materials. At peak operations, planes landed in Berlin every 30 seconds. Think about those numbers for a moment. 2.3 million tons, by air, into a single city, under threat of Soviet interference, through weather that grounded civilian aviation, using equipment that was often breaking down from overuse. Soviet military doctrine said it couldn't be done. Soviet planners had calculated it was impossible. Soviet intelligence couldn't understand how it succeeded. Yet every day, Berlin woke up to American and British planes delivering the city's lifeline. The cost was staggering. The United States spent $224 million on the operation, over $2.8 billion in today's money. Britain spent $17 million. The fuel consumed could have powered a small country. Dozens of aircraft were written off from excessive wear, but West Berlin remained free. The human cost was real too. 78 Allied personnel killed in accidents. Pilots who flew themselves to exhaustion, operating on coffee and determination. Ground crews who worked through winter storms to keep planes flying. German workers who unloaded aircraft for hours in freezing conditions. But the Berliners never forgot. When the blockade ended, over 300,000 Berliners gathered at the Reichstag to thank the Allies. Ernst Reuter, West Berlin's mayor, spoke for them all. "You saved our lives. You proved to the world that freedom is worth fighting for, even when the fight is measured in tons of coal and bags of flour." One elderly German woman, interviewed years later, remembered, "Every 3 minutes I heard a plane. Day and night. That sound meant we would survive. When I hear a plane now, I still feel grateful." The Berlin Airlift proved something Stalin never understood. In modern conflict, logistics can be a weapon as powerful as any army. The Soviets tried to starve Berlin into submission. The Allies responded by turning the sky into a supply highway, but the victory was more than logistical. It was psychological. The airlift showed the world that democracy could respond to aggression without firing a shot. That Western resolve wasn't just propaganda. That ordinary pilots and ground crews could defeat political intimidation through determination and ingenuity. For the Germans, the impact was transformative. 3 years after World War II ended, former enemies were risking their lives to save German civilians. The gesture wasn't lost on Berliners. It laid the foundation for German-American friendship that endures today. For the Soviets, the airlift was a disaster. Stalin's blockade had been designed to drive the West from Berlin. Instead, it strengthened Western unity and humiliated Soviet planning. The blockade's failure contributed to the formation of NATO, a month before it ended, as Western nations realized collective defense was necessary. The airlift also changed military thinking. Before Berlin, air transport was considered a supplement to ground logistics. After Berlin, it became clear that air power could sustain entire operations. The lessons learned influenced everything from the Korean War to modern humanitarian relief operations. The Berlin Airlift doesn't have the drama of D-Day or the sacrifice of Iwo Jima. There were no beach assaults, no desperate last stands, just pilots flying cargo planes into a besieged city, day after day, through winter storms and Soviet threats. But those pilots were heroes in the truest sense. They understood that their mission wasn't glorious. Hauling coal wasn't exciting. Flying the same route 40 times a month wasn't adventure. But they knew 2 million lives depended on them. Lieutenant Paul Totten described the mindset. "You're exhausted. The weather's terrible. Your plane's making weird noises because it's flown too many hours without proper maintenance. But you think about those German kids watching for your plane, and you fly anyway." The ground crews deserve equal recognition. Mechanics kept aircraft flying far beyond normal service intervals. Loaders perfected unloading techniques that shaved minutes off turnaround times. Weather forecasters learned to predict Berlin's unpredictable conditions. Administrative staff coordinated the logistical puzzle that was 278 flights. and the Berliners themselves played a part. Thousands worked as unloaders, earning wages and contributing to their own survival. They endured rationing that was strict by peacetime standards, but generous compared to the starvation the Soviets intended. They trusted that the planes would keep coming, and that trust was never betrayed. The Berlin Airlift teaches us something profound about determination and logistics. Stalin thought blockading Berlin would force the West to quit. He calculated tonnage requirements, aircraft capacity, and weather limitations. On paper, he was right. The airlift should have been impossible, but Stalin forgot that logistics isn't just mathematics. It's will. It's people working beyond their limits because they believe the cause is worth it. It's ground crews fixing planes in snowstorms. It's pilots flying through fog when every instinct says to turn back. It's a city enduring rationing because they trust the supply planes will return tomorrow. In today's world, we face challenges that seem impossible, problems that don't have easy solutions, obstacles that calculations say can't be overcome. The Berlin Airlift reminds us that determination can exceed what planning predicts. The pilots flying into Berlin didn't have better planes than the Soviets predicted. They didn't discover a magical solution. They simply refused to quit. Day after day, month after month, they kept flying, and that persistence changed history. When you face something that seems impossible, remember those cargo pilots. Remember the ground crews working through winter nights. Remember the Berliners who trusted that tomorrow's plane would arrive. They proved that when logistics meets determination, even blockades can be overcome. The sound of aircraft engines over Berlin in 1948 wasn't just the sound of deliveries. It was the sound of freedom refusing to be starved into submission. It was democracy proving that it could outlast tyranny. It was ordinary people doing extraordinary things because surrender wasn't an option. The Berlin Airlift ended 76 years ago, but its lesson endures. The side that refuses to quit, that commits to the mission regardless of cost, that turns logistics into a weapon, that side wins. Not always quickly, not always easily, but eventually, determination defeats calculation. So the next time someone tells you something can't be done, that the numbers don't work, that logistics make it impossible, remember Berlin. Remember 228 flights. Remember 2.3 million tons delivered by air. Remember pilots who flew themselves to exhaustion, and a city that never stopped believing the planes would come. And if you found meaning in this story of persistence against impossible odds, remember that history is filled with similar moments, times when ordinary people refused to accept what planners said was impossible. Keep exploring these stories with me. There's always another lesson waiting in the past.